Hello and welcome to the Crystal Palace podcast. I'm Alfonso Greenbrook, and in today's podcast I'll be looking over the game against Tottenham by bringing you my match review, player rankings and my man of the match. As well as this, I'm also going to bring you interviews with Roy Hodgson, James Tompkins, James McArthur and Cheku Kouyaté after the game. So let's begin. Palace fell 2-0 to Tottenham Hotspur in their new stadium with goals from Heung-min and Christian Eriksen. The smoke from the elaborate opening pre-match firework display had barely settled before Vicente Gaeta picked off where he left off at Selhurst Park on Saturday, comfortably collecting a Dele Alli header. From the resulting passage of play from Gaeta's distribution, the Eagles registered their first chance, with Jeffrey Slutt picking up a delightfully weighted lofty ball from Luka Milivojevic, but the Ghanaian international blazed over despite breaking the Spurs' defensive line. Spurs began to probe and press, and in the 10th minute, Heung-min, try as he might, couldn't find a way through the Palace defence, as the South Korean international scuttled across the Eagles' penalty box, trying to work an opening. Eventually, Song gave up and teed up Christian Eriksen, but a Dane's shot rolled past an unfazed Gaeta for a goal kick. Patrick Vanana was the next player to stop Spurs from opening their goal account in their new stadium, with the Dutchman sprinting across from left-back to block Eriksen's effort from 20 yards out in the centre of Gaeta's goal. Spurs clearly wanted an early goal within the opening 20 minutes, however a resolute, compact and well organised Roy Hodgson's side were intercepting the ball time and time again, much to the Lilywhites' faithful's growing frustration. Next to try and break down the Eagles' resilience was Kieran Trippier, who worked his way into the penalty box before finding Eriksen unmarked in the box 8 yards out. But just like the Terrors found on Saturday, it wasn't easy getting past Palace's number one, and Gaeta reacted sharply to get down to his right hand side before Martin Kelly fully cleared the danger. Spurs continued to probe, and with 21 minutes on the clock, they almost took the lead in the luckiest of circumstances. A lofted ball over the top of Palace's defensive line from Dele Alli was intended for Eriksen, who continued to find himself in goal-scoring positions in the opening half of the first half. However, the England international's ball just evaded the running of Kane and flew narrowly past the Crystal Palace post, much to the relief of the vocal red and blue section of the stadium. Spurs were now camped inside the Palace half, and their later chance came when Milivojevic found Ali right outside the penalty box. However, from the resulting free kick, Michy Batshuayi headed away well from inside the wall. The first historic stat for the records arrived in the 28th minute, when Ali exacted revenge on Palace's captain for a foul moments ago, with referee Andre Maria dishing out the first yellow card in a new stadium to the Englishman. Almost 10 minutes passed until the next real moment of notice in the game, with Son forcing Gaeta to edge the ball past his post for a corner. James Tompkins was the next in the long line of Palace players digging deep to thwart Spurs taking the lead, with the centre-back sprinting across in the 42nd minute to close down Danny Rose, as his fellow countryman was readying himself to take aim inside the box. Kane rose to highest a few moments later from a corner, with the striker's header going wide, again an attempt that Palace's man between the sticks had covered all the way. The second half started in much the same vein as the first 45, with Trippier and Son sending efforts over inside the first few minutes. When 51 minutes arrived, it almost saw the Eagles took the lead via the inside of Batshuayi's right foot, with the Belgian breaking the offside trap, bringing the ball down delicately onto his chest before cutting inside Trippier and sending the ball just wide from outside the box. As the Spurs fans began to get restless, Kane thought he'd managed to work some space inside the box, but just as the South stand rose behind the goal the Englishman was facing, Kelly put an end to any potential celebrations with a solid block on 53 minutes. Eventually, 55 minutes of the Lilywhites probing finally came to fruition, with Son finding himself one-on-one with Tompkins, before cutting inside the defender, taking it away from the rushing back Cheku Kouyaté, and the resulting shot from the South Korean deflected, unfortunately, into the back of Gaeta's net. With Palace now looking to draw level and pushing up, Spurs almost made the South Londoners pay when Kane went clean through. However, Spurs' top scorer this season curled his effort high and wide. Son looked to double his and Spurs' tally in the 73rd minute. However, despite having plenty of time, the Tottenham forwards' effort lacked any pace and precision and tamely found Gaeta in the centre of his goal. As Palace looked to maintain their 100% record in wearing their home kit in away games this season, Hodgson sent Andros Townsend and Christian Benteke out to warm up. Townsend was the first of the aforementioned duo to enter the field against his former club, replacing Slupp in the 79th minute. A minute later, however, Palace found themselves 2-0 down as Kane bundled his way through the penalty area, and after a couple of falls and blocks, the ball found its way to Eriksen, who smashed home from close range. Palace pushed to find a way back into the game, and 2 chances in quick succession almost gave the Eagles something to cheer about. Firstly, Fernando saw a cross-come shot almost deceive Hugo Lloris, before Christian Benteke headed wide from yards out moments later. Next to try and give the Eagles a lifeline was Wilfried Zaha, with the Ivorian going on his trademark mazy run through the Spurs penalty area and drawing a fine close-range save from Lloris. Despite a flurry of opportunities in the final stages, it wasn't meant to be for Palace, with Spurs winning 2-0. So I'm now going to move on to my player ratings, but before I start, don't forget you can follow us on both Twitter and Facebook at Crystal Palace for all latest Palace news. So if you are someone like myself who does like to follow a vast array of Palace accounts, whether that be on Twitter or Facebook, then of course do head over to the respective sites and follow our accounts at Crystal Palace. Now, in terms of all the latest Palace news we do post in there, obviously we do post general club news, whether that be stuff about the academy, about the stadium, and obviously any sort of ongoings about the club. But alongside that sort of general news, we obviously do regularly update it with the latest transfer news. So even though we're not in the transfer window at the minute, there's lots of rumours as to who might be coming in, who might be going out during the summer transfer window. So if you do want to keep up to date, and I personally would say that we're quite good at actually getting news articles out there and posted on Twitter as soon as we sort of see them and source them. So if you are someone who wants a place to get all the latest transfer news, then of course follow us on there. And alongside that as well, we do obviously do post interviews as well, so whether that be with management, whether that be with players, or even, let's say, even pundits' views of Palace, or I suppose anybody's views of Palace, of course head over there as well to get these interviews as well. So if you are someone who wants another account to follow, not just for essentially just sort of general club news, but of course for transfer news, for interviews, all things like that, and of course follow both of our accounts at Crystal Palace. And of course, if you are someone in particular who's looking for another account to follow for just a few different opinions, so whether that be before the game, what we think might happen, what we predict the lineup to be, or whether that be after the game, given that instant match reaction, because of course I personally don't mainly run the page, the Twitter page, but of course there's a guy on there who gives his instant match reaction, so giving you an idea before the podcast comes out what we as a page think of the game. So if you are someone who wants to get the news, transfer news, as well as just opinions as well, of course head over to Twitter in particular at Crystal Palace, where of course you can follow us for all of that stuff there. Now, another great place for you guys to share your opinion is in the YouTube comments. So if you are listening to the podcast on YouTube, then do feel free to drop a comment below the video with your player ratings, where you rate the players' performances from 1 to 10, and that is of course with 10 being the best. Now, the main reason I want you to do this is that rather than me just having my general opinion of the game, which of course I'll go into a little bit more detail later on, but rather than me just having that opinion, I want you guys to comment your own opinion below so that I can read through them, see what you guys thought about the players' performances, obviously look at it and compare whether we sort of thought the players had similar performances, and also, you know, if there are any disagreements, of course we can feel free to discuss that. So if you are someone who might have a different opinion to me, or just wants to get involved in the podcast, obviously feel free to drop a comment below with your player ratings, obviously so that I can read it. Even other people who come to the video, whether they be Palace or Tottenham fans, they can also read it just to get a more general view of the game, rather than just having a single sort of individual view of the game. They can just read the comment section, build a broader view, and certainly for myself looking back at it, rather than me just thinking, you know, putting out there on the podcast what I think about players' performances, actually let's have a discussion in the comment section below, obviously maybe discussing in a little bit more detail. And even if you don't want to do your player ratings, just feel free to comment below anything about the game. Obviously from a Palace perspective, a little bit disappointing considering in the first half we were very good defensively, but lacked that little bit in that final third. You know, we got up to the final third, then we sort of just gave away possession, wasted it, and then obviously the fact that we brought on subs too late, we didn't react to the fact that Spurs scored the first goal, and we were quite sloppy in terms of the 2 goals we conceded. Whereas Spurs, on the other hand, they're going to be very happy in their new stadium. Looks great, I've got to be honest, quite jealous the fact they've got this brand new fantastic looking stadium. So of course there's going to be different views of the game, so alongside your player ratings, of course feel free just to comment below with your general views of the game. And once again, that's just so that myself and even other people who come to the video can also read the comment section just to see what you guys thought about the game. And if at any point you might have something that you might disagree with me, you know, something you may have said or may think that I've said wrong, or something you may think that actually I'm wrong in terms of my opinion, feel free to comment that below as well and just question it. And of course I'm more than happy to actually have discussions in that comment section below. Now, if you do want to follow any of the social media pages that I've mentioned or join our Facebook group, then do check all links that will be in the description below. But I'm now going to move on to my player rating, starting in goal with Vicente Gaeta, who I'm going to give a 7 overall. Now, in terms of Gaeta's performance, there isn't really too much to say about his performance in terms of a bad perspective, because even though it was a disappointing performance in the fact that we defended well for the most part, but still lost 2-0 because of a few sort of mistakes in the midfield and defence, actually, aside from them mistakes, I think Gaeta had a really good game. So in terms of what I'm going to be talking about in quite a lot of detail with other players in terms of the mistakes we made and tactics, all stuff like that, there isn't actually too much to say about Gaeta. Now, the reason I've given him a 7 is just because I thought he was one of our standout players, and the reason for that was just the sheer number of saves he made throughout the game. If it wasn't for him being as solid as he was, we could have lost the game. Even, I suppose in that first half, we could have been 2, maybe even 3-0 down in that first half if Gaeta hadn't been solid and made the saves he made. And of course, 0-0 going into the second half. Yes, we still went on to lose 2-0, but there were numerous occasions at 1-0, at 2-0, where, Spurs could have gone on to score even more goals. So the fact that when it was 0-0, Gaeta was making himself big and making important saves, and the fact that when Spurs went ahead, and of course went ahead even further, the fact that he was still continuing to make saves to at least give us a little bit more dignity in terms of the scoreline was of course great to see. Now, there was one in particular I really want to talk about, and that was one terrific save where he got down really low to stop a Christian Eriksen effort, and that was really early on in the game. Now, I think it was about 10-20 minutes into the game. Now, if that had gone in, 1-0 up, a few minutes or so into the game, and of course Spurs are already going to have the upper hand. So if that had gone in, probably would have been a different story, and we might have lost maybe probably more than 2-0, you're looking at your 3s or maybe even your 4-0. So the fact that Gaeta so early on in the game was alert to get down to that Christian Eriksen effort was of course great to see. But then there was a Son shot, which obviously did go across his post as well, quite luckily in that respect, but he did stumble at that. So realistically, he made a number of good saves throughout the game. Obviously the Christian Eriksen one in particular is the one that I specifically want to talk about, because there was too many other saves, and we don't really want to go through each of them individually. But obviously, aside from that save and the fact that he made excellent saves throughout the rest of the game, there was only one moment, Son had a chance, had a shot inside the box. He did fumble a little bit with that one, but it did go around the post. So arguably, can't really say too much there. But then again, maybe you could say on another day, he wouldn't stumble or fumble, whichever word you want to use. And of course, maybe he could have done better there. But overall, Vicente Gaeta here, very impressive performance from him. And, considering we lost 2-0, it's quite good that we're giving the goalkeeper praise, which just goes to show that actually it wasn't really his fault for the goals we conceded. Nothing he could do about them. And like I said, aside from the goals, which weren't his fault, and obviously that little bit of a stumble with the Son shot, I think he was absolutely superb in terms of making a few saves here and there. And whilst maybe you could argue his distribution should be a little bit better, or in terms of his presence from set pieces, in terms of going to claim corners and things like that, maybe that could improve. But in this game here, going to give him a 7, because like I've said, one of the few players to actually come out of the game with a bit of credit, because he obviously kept us in the game numerous times. So I'm now going to move on to the first player in our defence, and that is the right back Aaron Wan-Bissaka, who I'm going to give an 8 overall. Now, to be honest, this is like probably about the 20th time I've given him an 8 out of 10 this season, and it just goes to show what a player he is. The fact that he's once again maintaining such high levels in terms of his performance is of course great to see, but the fact that he continues to do it against the top 6 clubs makes it even better, because it's alright playing really well against people like Huddersfield, like many teams he's played against this season, but when he does it against top 6 teams, just makes it even better in terms of his performances, and just goes that little bit further just to prove how much of a talent he is. Now, one of the reasons I've given him an 8, and I suppose this is the overall reason, is just the fact that down that left hand side, obviously Spurs quite often like to attack down both flanks, but actually Aaron Wan-Bissaka down their left hand side done a really decent job of actually keeping them at bay and essentially just restricting all of the chances they had. And there was one chance in particular, not necessarily down to his defending, but he actually brought the ball out of the defence superbly well and was able to carry it forward. So not only was he doing that defensive work well in terms of keeping Spurs at bay, but when Spurs were pressuring us when we were in possession, he was still able to actually bring the ball out from that defence really well. Calmness personified essentially with that little bit of play. So overall, really impressive in terms of both his defensive and offensive performance. And you've got to look at him and go, what a talent he is. The fact that he's performing consistently well week in, week out is of course great to see, But like I've said just a few moments ago, the fact that he continuously does it against the top 6 clubs just makes him seem even better. And, you know, on what was a very disappointing night for Palace, him and Gaeta were two players in particular who actually came out with quite a lot of praise, purely just to the fact that it wasn't really down to them why we lost the game. And in terms of, obviously we didn't have lots of good play in the game, but most of our good play came from people like Wan-Bissaka, like Gaeta and like Tompkins, who I'm going to talk about. So overall, I do think Wan-Bissaka done what he normally does in terms of making tackles, making blocks, and overall I think the word you could use is competent, because in terms of his standards, this was a competent performance, doing what you expect from him, so of course that was great to see. And you know, there was a stat after the game that Heung-min was the first player since probably like sort of December time to actually get past him. So before that point, only 7 players this season have actually got past Wan-Bissaka. Is now up to 8, because I believe it was Son who got past him. But the fact that it's taken this long for actually another player to actually get past Wan-Bissaka sort of on a one-on-one situation really just goes to show once again how well he's playing recently, in the fact that it's taken that long for this thing to happen. So overall for me, I'm going to give Wan-Bissaka an 8 overall, because like I said, it was a very impressive performance from him in what was a disappointing performance from Palace. You know, making blocks, making challenges, bringing the ball out of the defence really well as well, which was a thing that was really impressive for me. And I suppose the only thing really for me which is limiting him at 8 as opposed to maybe a 9, which some people could argue, is just the fact that I think he missed Townsend in front of him. Now that wasn't just in terms of the defensive play, because sometimes Townsend gives that cover, but for me it was in particular his attacking play, because we've seen in recent weeks how Wan-Bissaka likes to go a little bit further forward, being a little bit more adventurous in terms of trying to put balls into the box. So that's been great to see that develop over the last sort of few weeks or so, but maybe that was missing from this game here. Maybe it was because of the tactics, because he was told to stay back and defend rather than go forward, or maybe it's just the fact that Townsend wasn't there just to give him that little bit of support on the overlap, or just an extra man there. Whatever it was, he probably could have done with Andros Townsend coming on a little bit earlier on in the game, or maybe starting the game, just because I think his presence in terms of Wan-Bissaka's offensive play could have been even better. But like I've said already, can't really fault him for anything other than that really tedious thing in the game there. So I do think overall the 8 is a fair result. So now I'm going to move on to the first centre back in our team, and that is Martin Kelly, who I'm going to give a 5 overall. Now in terms of Martin Kelly's performance, it was quite interesting in the fact that quite a lot of people after the game were saying he had a very terrible game, which of course I can see why some people have said that. And then on the other hand, as well as sort of Tompkins, you know, they were saying that actually some parts of the game, his game were quite good, albeit he was the poorer of the 2 centre backs. So of course there's a little bit of variation, let's say, in how people thought his performance was. But I personally have given him the 5 overall, because I do think that is a fair reflection of his performance. Now in terms of you know, his involvement in the match, you know, he had a few hairy moments, as did many players in the game, and essentially that's just because of the quality that Spurs had. You know, nothing we could do. They're by far the superior team, so of course with where they're trying to play down, break us down, you know, trying to, you know, essentially score most of their chances, because they were creating loads of chances. They were just trying to have that clinical edge just to finish their chances off. There were a few moments, especially involving Kelly, where it was a little bit hairy in the fact that if, you know, he'd done something a little bit wrong, and we were quite fortunate that nothing came off of it, and all different things like that really is why I suppose I understand why people thought he had an absolutely bad performance. Now there was one chance in particular where he probably should have been punished, but once again that luck sort of came into it, where we were quite lucky that nothing came off it, and that's where he gave the ball away, very poor, you know, in terms of giving away possession, and of course that allowed Harry Kane to run through on goal, but of course his shot, he put it over the bar. So there was just one particular example where actually Martin Kelly, yes, he may have done alright defensively, but you know, when he's trying to play out from the back, he knows the quality of Spurs, but still he needlessly gives away possession so easily. And if on another day Harry Kane would have easily scored that. So that one example in particular really sort of highlights his performance overall, and I think it really epitomises how he played, in the fact that he done alright in some parts, but then the majority of his game was quite poor in that respect. Now defensively, like I said already, he done okay, and I suppose when I say that, I'm mainly talking about the first half. We kept it 0-0 at half time, and I do think for the most part we were quite solid in that half. You know, we were literally putting our bodies on the line, left, right and centre, and then that was working because we were stopping Spurs. But the thing that was disappointing is that after half time, whereas Tompkins seemed to just relish it and he seemed to improve, Martin Kelly on the other hand just seemed to go a little bit downhill. Distribution was getting even poorer than it was in the first half, and of course, like I said already, nearly gifted Spurs a goal as well. So you've got Martin Kelly here, I suppose a real mix of a performance, in the fact that his defensive was okay for the most part, but then obviously key moments in the game we could have been punished if obviously Tottenham players had been a little bit more clinical, and that all came down to a few mistakes from Kelly at the back. So overall, isn't really more too much to say about his game performance, other than the fact that I personally called for him to start, because of course Scott Dan didn't have the best of performances, or hasn't had the best of performances in recent weeks. So I understood Martin Kelly coming back into the side, but then maybe we might have to change it up again, just because Kelly's performance here against Spurs was a little bit disappointing. So I do think overall the 5 is a fair reflection. So I'm now going to move on to our second centre-back, and that is James Tompkins, who I'm going to give a 7 overall. Now obviously, much like Martin Kelly, I suppose I might as well start on that first half period. Obviously kept it 0-0 at half time, and Tompkins was quite crucial to that, because nothing seemed to get past him in that first half. He was making blocks, headers, left, right and centre, and essentially, obviously the rest of the team done their part, albeit we weren't great in that first half other than defensively. But I do think Tompkins has had a big part to play in that, because if it wasn't for some of his individual tackles and blocks and things like this, maybe we would have conceded in that first half. So in that first half in particular, nothing seemed to get past him, and that's just because of how solid James Tompkins was. And like I've said already, making tackles all over the shop really sort of epitomised his performances. I suppose epitomises a James Tompkins performance, making tackles, making blocks, winning headers. That's what you would normally expect from James Tompkins, and that's exactly what we got and more in that first half period. And I suppose looking back at the game, I've given him a 7, and that's mainly down in particular to that first half performance. Now in terms of a few of the chances that Spurs had, obviously quite a lot of the time they were playing the ball down the centre, and of course Tompkins had to be the man to deal with that, and actually he done alright in terms of heading the ball away, especially when the danger was coming from the centre of the field. And I do think maybe there was a few other chances, particularly with the second goal we conceded, where maybe he should have done better. But like I've said with Vicente Gaeta, goals aside, Tompkins was one of these players, as joined by Wan-Bissaka, as joined by Gaeta, who actually, goals aside, actually had a fairly decent performance. But like I've said already, heading everything away down the centre of the park. But in terms of the goal, obviously that wasn't able to be headed away because it was a ball on the ground. But what he done, rather than actually making a tackle or making a block like he had done in the first half, he essentially sort of just stood there, let Eriksen, knock the ball around on the edge of the area. And of course he notched that second goal, which of course made it 2-0, killed the game right dead there. And obviously it was game match set. But other than that mistake, in terms of just watching Eriksen go through and score, as opposed to actually being active and making a challenge, or at least making it difficult for Eriksen to get the shot away, he didn't quite do that. And I suppose that's probably the reason I've limited him to a 7 as opposed to an 8, which of course I gave to Wan-Bissaka. And it's just mainly down to that second goal. If he didn't make that mistake, or even if he wasn't in the area of the field, wasn't involved in that, I probably still would have given him an 8. But the fact that remains that if he could have done a little bit more in terms of that goal, is why I've given him a 7 as opposed to an 8. But overall, isn't really much more to say about Tompkins, other than the fact that aside from the goal, he was absolutely solid at the back. In that first half, nothing seemed to get past him. Much the same in the second half, like I've said already, aside from the goal. But like I said already, a very good performance from him. And I suppose I've talked quite a lot recently in the fact that he seems to have missed Sakho in terms of it's been affecting his performances. But it was nice to see this was a performance in a step to his old self, in the fact that he was solid at the back. So once again, James Tompkins here, I do think he deserves the 7 I've given him. So I'm now going to move on to the final player in our back 4, and that is the left back Patrick Van Aanholt, who I'm going to give a 6 overall. Now in terms of Van Aanholt's performance, it has been one that divides opinion, in the fact that some people thought, after Saturday, he actually had quite a good performance, in the fact that he was probably, in terms of an attacking perspective, one of our better players. Not the best, but one of our best. But then on the other hand, defensively, he was a bit suspect once again, and obviously that's why he's divided opinion, in the fact that some people thought his performance was alright in comparison to some of his teammates. Obviously that's not the majority, but nevertheless that's opinion there. And of course on the other hand, people thinking he had absolutely terrible games. So of course there's a mix of opinions there, and I've given him a 6 because I've sort of given him the benefit of the doubt, and of course I've factored in both sort of opinions. But I might as well sort of start with the positives, I suppose, of his performance. And obviously one of them was in the attacking sense. I do think he made a lot of runs going forward, marauding runs, let's say. And in terms of attacking Spurs down that left hand side, down their right hand side, I think he done a fairly decent job at doing that. And when you consider Spurs, even though they have wingers who can obviously exploit you down their flanks, they also play quite narrow at times as well. People like Son like to play quite narrow. So that obviously meant that there was not a lot of space, but space nonetheless for us to exploit down either flank. And I suppose Van Aanholt done that alright, in terms of he was able to get the ball forward and make these marauding ones going forward. Much what was the case, for quite a lot of players. we were very good at defending and actually getting the ball to the midfield, but after that we couldn't do anything with it, and we just gave away possession again and just kept giving the ball away to Tottenham. So whilst we were good at getting the ball off Tottenham, then getting forward, we didn't have something to take it that next step further. And obviously Van Aanholt's one of these players who sort of suffered due to that, in the fact that yes, you could give the ball to him and he could make a run down that left flank, but then after that, at that point, you know, where you would expect him to make a pass, or you know, at least do sort of a 1-2 or whatever you expect him to do, he couldn't do that, but just because maybe there wasn't enough support in certain occasions, or maybe it's just the fact that Tottenham were defending well. Whatever it was, whenever he got forward, we were able to get forward, but we didn't have the ability to do anything after that. And I suppose Van Aanholt's one of these players who actually made loads of runs going forward, so was looking to make a positive impact, but nothing really came off of it. And I suppose for the main part, he defended okay. You know, he wasn't brilliant, and quite a few times we were put under pressure because he weren't defending that great. But I suppose you've got to look at both sides of it. Like I've said already, you know, some parts of his defending was alright, in terms of there was a few challenges he made which could have stopped chances that Spurs had, and obviously on the other hand, a few times he could have done better. And I suppose that leads me nicely on to the fact that the 2 goals we scored. Now, obviously there's a lot of blaming going on here. Obviously you're looking at, you know, well, you're looking at the goals and you're looking at people like Luka Milivojevic, you're looking at people like Van Aanholt, who are obviously at fault for them. Obviously the first goal, taking a massive deflection, obviously goes in, wrong foot's Gaeta, nothing he could do, but obviously we could have closed down Son a bit quicker. And obviously for the second goal, obviously Van Aanholt, a little bit ball watching, maybe could have done better, but of course Milivojevic giving the ball away so needlessly in midfield. So you're looking at that going, actually for both of the goals, Van Aanholt was involved somewhat, maybe not entirely to blame, but involved somewhat, which of course is why people were quite disappointed, because it's little mistakes like this where players switch off that really we get punished. Because if we hadn't have made these mistakes and we carried on defending as we did in that first half, we'd probably go on to draw the game 0-0. But because of these little mistakes, little lapses of concentration from people like Van Aanholt, people like Milivojevic, things like this which of course lose us the game, and I suppose that's just the theme of our season overall. Now going back to a positive of his performance, I might as well sandwich that negative in between 2 positives, and that's the fact that he almost scored with a cross himself. Obviously I already mentioned that he got forward quite a lot, but there was one chance in particular, got forward, put in a cross, or floated in a cross towards the far corner, but of course it was a cross come shot almost, because he meant for it to be a shot, it ended up being a shot. Sorry, he wanted it to be a cross, ended up being a shot, but it was obviously clawed away by Lloris. So a few chances here and there where in an attacking sense he was quite good, but like I said already, a little bit suspect at times defensively. But overall, obviously feel free to comment below with your opinion, but I do think the 6 overall is a fair result. And like I said at the beginning, I've given him the benefit of the doubt, because some parts of his game were good, other parts were quite average. So I do think overall, for Van Aanholt, our left back, I do think the 6 was a fair result. So I'm now going to move into the midfield, and I'm going to start with the captain, Luka Milivojevic, who I'm going to give a 5 overall. Now, obviously I might as well start with the first goal. I mentioned it briefly talking about Van Aanholt, but obviously, firstly, I've given Luka a 5, mainly because of that first goal, because he was obviously at fault for the goal. First goal they've scored in a new stadium. It took a massive deflection, and it's obviously quite good for Spurs. They've got the first goal at the new stadium. You know, the luck was on their side. But then on the other hand, you know, we really don't want to have that record of being or conceding that first goal at a new stadium, with it being as scrappy as it was in terms of it taking a deflection. But nevertheless, obviously Luka Milivojevic was at fault for that first goal in the stadium. Obviously the first issue with that goal was obviously he was out-muscled by Eriksen. Obviously that is the first issue. And when you consider, you know, Luka's got to be one of the biggest players on the pitch in terms of physicality and height, you would expect him, or you wouldn't expect him out of all the people in the team to actually lose the ball. So obviously getting out-muscled by Eriksen is of course disappointing because of that. And of course when Son, you know, we know Son likes to score against Palace, but when he cut inside from that pass from Eriksen, you know, the fact that Milivojevic obviously attempted to slide tackle, make a sliding challenge and actually get the ball off Son, yes, that's fine, but in the end obviously Son's already, you know, had that connection, and it took a massive deflection of Milivojevic, and of course that wrong-footed Gaeta. So a lot of things wrong with that first goal. Obviously the fact that we give the ball away so easily, and the fact that, you know, we got out-muscled by Eriksen firstly, and then secondly tries to tackle Son, but in doing so allows the ball to take a deflection and wrong-foot Gaeta. So lots of things wrong with that goal. But I do think, just aside from the goal we conceded, I just think his general midfield play was very poor, and it wasn't just because of the goal. It was the fact that he kept losing possession. So he was one of the main culprits in the fact that we could get the ball out of the defence, but whenever we looked to counter-attack, we weren't able to, get the ball to our attackers, or we weren't able to pass the ball without it being intercepted. So Luka was one of the main culprits for that. And I suppose, I gave him quite a lot of praise in recent weeks in the fact that he seemed to be getting back to himself, both defensively and the fact that he was scoring penalties. But this game here, he seemed to be off the pace once again. And like I've said, it wasn't just because of that sort of defensive work. It was also the fact that he was losing possession, just giving Tottenham the respect they deserve respect in terms of their league position, but we shouldn't go there giving them respect. We should be there for a fight. So the fact that we made it a little bit too easy for Spurs, especially in the midfield, was obviously disappointing. And of course Luka was quite, I wouldn't say quite key to that because that's not the right term because it's a negative, but I suppose he was the main culprit of that, in the fact that we were just giving possession away to Spurs and just allowing them to take a greater hold of the game. But like I said, there isn't really much more to say about Luka's performance other than the fact that it was quite a disappointing one from the captain. I've given him a 5, firstly because of the 2 mistakes leading up to that first goal. Obviously the first of those being the fact that he got easily outmuscled by Eriksen, and the second of that being that actually when Son cut inside, obviously Milivojevic attempted to make that sliding challenge, but in the end it deflected off him. So 2 things in terms of that first goal he's obviously at fault for, and of course just his overall midfield play where he was losing possession, just seemed off the pace in terms of his overall play. That really sort of combinated in a disappointing performance. And I suppose if I weren't so generous, and I've seen other people do it, I probably could have justified giving him a 4 overall because his performance was that bad. But let's hope, fresh start, few days to go till the game against Newcastle. Hopefully train over that, get a new sort of fresh mindset, and hopefully put in a good performance against Newcastle, because that is a key game. We weren't expected to beat Tottenham, but we should have at least given it a go rather than just sitting back and hoping for a 0-0 draw. So we need people like Luka in particular to actually step up and help us get a result. Touch wood, we can get something against Newcastle, but of course it's no easy place to go. So once again, Luka Milivojevic here, the captain, is going to give him a 5 overall. So I'm now going to move on to one of his midfield partners, and that is Cheku Kjarte, who I'm going to give a 6 overall. Now, to be honest, there isn't really too much to say about Kjaerte's performance because he essentially just went about the midfield, done a shift for the side, and albeit he wasn't great in comparison to some of his recent performances, and certainly the performances we've seen this season, it was still a performance where you can't really fault him too much, mainly just because he was just sort of average in comparison to other players, he was obviously better than them. Now, obviously his main job in the team was obviously to sit in front of the back 4, and for that first half I think he done it superbly well. Him and Luka protecting the back 4, along with the back 4 making tackles and blocks left, right and centre. They've done a really good job in that first half because we went in at 0-0 at half time, and actually I do think Kjarte in particular deserved credit because his sort of work in front of the back 4 was really good. And I think that in terms of marshalling the play, controlling the midfield, and in terms of being one of the only players not to just give away possession so easily to Tottenham, you've got to give him credit for that. So in terms of his role in the side, I've given him a 6 because I think he executed that really well. Now, one of the things I've talked about already is the fact that we were very good at getting the ball out from the defence, making tackles, making blocks, and then sort of recycling the ball. But when we got into the final third, or even in the second third, we didn't necessarily have that creativity or the skill, or maybe even the intent to do anything further than that. So as soon as we get out of our own area, we seem to give the ball away. But actually, Kjarte was one of the only players who actually looked to get forward as much as possible, and not only looking but actually trying. So whenever he got the ball, he was looking to drive forward, and especially when we went behind, 1-0 down, 2-0 down, he was one of the players who sort of had that impetus to actually go forward and actually try and attempt to get something in the game, whereas other players in the field just seem to be sort of, I suppose you could say, sort of scared, or sort of a rabbit in the headlights, let's say. As soon as they got into Tottenham's half of the field, they sort of seemed to stop and didn't seem to know what to do going forward. And I suppose Kjarte was one of the few players who seemed to have a little bit more impetus in terms of that side of his play. But I suppose one of the other negatives, or a negative about his performance, is just like most of the other team, because it was a lacklustre performance across the field, he didn't see much of the ball in the attacking sense. So whilst he was trying to get the ball forward, and whilst he was trying to bring Palace further up the pitch when we were trying to counter, because of the domination Spurs had in that midfield and the fact that we kept giving the possession away, just meant that people like Kjarte, who are normally quite good on the ball, didn't see as much of it in an attacking sense as he would have liked, because I'm sure if we had a little bit more possession, or we weren't just giving the ball away so freely, if we gave Kouyaté the chance to actually drive forward, then maybe we would have seen a few more effective attacks going forward. But overall, Cheikhou Kouyaté here, like I said at the beginning, isn't really too much more to say about his game. You know, no real key points to bring out, but I suppose people were calling for him to start. He started, done on the right shift, but when you consider the rest of his teammates were quite lacklustre, I do think the 6 overall is a fair result. So now I'm going to move on to the final player in the midfield, and that is James McArthur, who I'm going to give a 6 overall. Now, I suppose McArthur's performance was much like the same in terms of our other midfield counterparts, in the fact that he was fairly average, in the fact that he wasn't really effective in what he was trying to do in the midfield. But I do think the reason I've given him a 6 is the fact that some parts of his game, I suppose much like Kouyaté, were quite effective, and much like people like Vanana, well, some of his parts of his game were quite effective, but then on the other hand he had some parts of his game where of course he was a little bit disappointing. So I do think overall the 6 I've given him is a fair result. Now, the first thing I really want to talk about is the fact that he hassled and harried, you know, and essentially, like he always does, he was actually trying to get the team on the front foot and was trying to get involved in the midfield. Now, obviously that's something we always come to expect from McArthur, and yes, some of his performances recently, bar sort of the Huddersfield game, have been quite disappointing in the fact that he hasn't actually deserved to keep his place in the side. This game here, he obviously did rightly deserve to start the game here, and as he showed quite early on in the game in terms of his involvement, in terms of helping us get into half-time 0-0, he was quite important to that, in terms of the way he was hurrying the Tottenham players, the way he was closing space down, and essentially, like he always does, just causing problems for the opposition in the midfield. That is something I think he done quite good. And, you know, yes, he was trying to get us onto the front foot, but just because of the quality that Spurs had, nothing really did come off. And, you know, there was one chance in particular, obviously this is quite late on into the game, but I might as well mention it nonetheless. You know, you put one ball into the box, very nice ball into the box, and literally Benteke only had to head it home, literally from a few yards out, but he headed it wide. So if that had gone in, I think it would have been 2-1 at that point. You know, you would be looking at McArthur's performance going, actually, your good work in the midfield, albeit he wasn't necessarily that effective in getting Palace something in the game. You know, that one moment where he actually got into a good advanced position and actually put a ball into the box, which almost was converted by Benteke, just goes to show, you know, sort of the fine margins of football, where you could have a performance when McArthur was fairly average, where it could have been really great if obviously Benteke was able to finish off that chance. But like I've said already, you know, and I suppose much like quite a lot of the players, you know, there isn't really too much more to say. You know, there's no sort of real moments of note to talk about with McArthur's performances, hence why I've given him the 6. And I just think it's because he's done what he always does in terms of working hard, but maybe, you know, you're looking at our attacking play, and, you know, you're looking at, we can get the ball out of the defence, but we can't take it any further than that, and we give away possession. McArthur should have been one of these players who actually should have been supporting the forwards, but instead he was working hard but didn't have that extra little bit to actually help us go forward and help us to push up the field, which ultimately, especially on the counter-attack, could have been really beneficial for us. Now, I don't know whether it's just because of him, in the fact that he wasn't looking to play that far forward like he's done in previous games this season, or whether it was down to tactics and the fact that we were just meant to sit back, defend, and try and hit them on the counter-attack with only people like Batshuayi, Slupp and Zaha involved. Whatever it was, whether it was tactics or just personal play, obviously he was a little bit disappointed not to see him go forward as much as he would have liked. But overall, I think I can really justify giving him a 6 overall, because like I said with Kouyaté, like I said with Vanana as well, you know, some good parts of his play, you know, in the fact that he was hurrying the Tottenham players in midfield, he was looking to get involved in an offensive sense, putting a good ball to Benteke, which he unfortunately didn't convert. So there are a few good parts of his game, but obviously the bad side is the fact that he probably should have done a lot better in terms of supporting the forwards, and obviously, you know, a few chances he had himself, especially in the midfield, in terms of creating chances and helping us set up attacks. He probably could have done better there. But overall, I do think the 6 for McArthur is a fair result. And obviously, once again, we go back to this midfield debate, and I do it week in, week out. But of course, feel free to comment below with your thoughts on what our midfield 3 or midfield 4, if you want to stick with the 4-4-2, what it should be going forward. Because of course, this game here is another game which has gone by, which is going to leave a lot of discussion in terms of Palace's midfield. But overall, James McArthur here, I do think he does deserve the 6 I've given him. So I'm now going to move on to the first player in our front 3, which of course, you know, the formation did change throughout the game, but it started as a 4-3-3, and that is the left winger Jeffrey Slupp, who I'm going to give a 6 overall. Now, I might as well start with the fact that he's obviously moved back to not necessarily his natural position, but a position where he's played previous to this season, and that was of course at left wing. And actually quite a lot this season, you know, we've been actually calling for him to be dropped from the side, because when he has played, especially in that left wing position, he's been quite disappointing. But of course, over the last sort of 3 months or so, he's found himself in central midfield and he's been superb there, and rightly so deserved to keep his place there. But this was a game where he'd gone a position he just got comfortable with in central midfield. He's obviously been moved back to this left wing role, and obviously it's no easy game to be moved into that position, because of course Tottenham is no mean feat. Now obviously we know how good he's been in central midfield recently, so you might expect him somewhat to bring that form into this game here, but he didn't really have an impact here, hence why I've given him a 6. And I just think it was mainly down to the fact that he was playing in a position which doesn't really seem to be suited to his style of play or the tactics Palace use. But then on the other hand, I just think Spurs defended well, dominated the game overall, so you can't really expect anything more there. Now, there was one glorious chance in particular that he had, and you know, this is one of the game-changing moments, like the Benteke header from that MacArthur cross. If Jeffrey Schlupp had scored this really early chance, rather than blazing over the bar, mate, we would have been 1-0 up, and it would have been a completely different story, you know, the first goal at the new stadium, and we would have had that momentum behind us. But instead, you know, obviously we've seen him score a few goals this season, quite good ones as well, when he's cut inside and got inside the box. But obviously on this occasion he blazed it over the bar, and that was of course on. We didn't have many forays forward in the game, but that was one of the chances we had going forward. But unfortunately for us, much has been the theme of our season in the fact that we've missed chances. That was obviously a disappointing part of his game. And I suppose one of the reasons for me overall why I think he had a poor game was maybe you could argue down to the position change, in the fact that he's playing in a position which ultimately is sort of his third choice position, because you would look at his season and go central midfield, then left back, then left wing in terms of ranking his positions. But I just think he just sort of lacked sort of a game awareness, and whether that's the fact that he's now more suited to having that awareness of playing the game down the middle, and maybe he's just not used to playing out wide, in the fact that you need to watch your runs to get onto ball, long balls, you need to watch the runs of, you know, your striker to actually get crosses into them. Whatever it was, you know, I just think his sort of game awareness was lacking just a little bit. And that's not just me alone, you know, I've looked online on Twitter, on the BBS, quite a lot of people talking about the fact that he was lacking a bit of awareness in his game. But overall, I do think Jeffrey Schlupp does deserve these 6 overall. Obviously he didn't have much impact, or as much impact as he would have liked, but of course I'm giving him the 6, sort of that benefit of the doubt, because he did have one of Palace's best chances to get ahead in the game right early on, but of course he put that effort over the bar. So overall I do think these 6 is a fair result. So I'm now going to move on to the striker in the team, and that is Michy Batshuayi, who I'm going to give a 5 overall. Now, in terms of Batshuayi's performances since he's joined Palace, he's been fairly, I wouldn't say consistent for us, but he's been fairly effective for us, in the fact that he's scored a few goals, you know, put in a contribution here and there, and arguably, you know, has been a good signing for us. But this game here against Tottenham was a disappointing one, hence why I've given him a 5, and it was just mainly due to the fact that he wasn't really involved, and whether that was just down to Tottenham defending well against him, or just the fact that we really didn't have that connection between the midfield and the attack. Whatever it was, and all the different aspects put together, is why I think overall he had a disappointing performance. Now, much like Jeffrey Schlupp, he had a chance, and he had many chances in the game, but one in particular early into that second half, and of course got a chance inside the box, went to shoot, but it whistled past Hugo Lloris's far post. So an opportunity there where arguably you know, it's probably easier to get it on target than miss, but of course from that angle he put it wide. So, you know, you're looking at that chance going, that could have been a game-changing moment for us, but still, you know, one of our players has put it wide, obviously in this case Batshuayi, and you really didn't really have any much chance to get onto the ball. And once again, like I said, that Spurs defended relatively well against him. It was mainly because whenever Spurs had the ball, they pressed quite high at the pitch, which essentially meant that Batshuayi didn't really have that freedom to obviously try and get in behind them, or at least try and actually get the ball from deep and actually drive forward. And that's something which I suppose is the theme of quite a lot of our attacking players in this game in particular, where we could get the ball, but we weren't able to do anything in the final third, and we just gave possession away, and essentially had to start that cycle again of getting the ball back by defending well, driving through the midfield, but then give the ball away back to Tottenham. So I do think, you know, you've got to look at Batshuayi and say he had a chance in the game, or had a few chances, but obviously couldn't quite finish them off and put them wide. But then on the other side, you know, he obviously found it quite difficult, mainly because of how Tottenham were playing overall. Now, one of the reasons I think he did suffer, aside from the fact that Tottenham defended relatively well, is just the fact that he got little service, and that's just because our main focus, especially the defence in the midfield, was just to essentially just absorb the pressure from Tottenham, clear the ball whenever he can, and we weren't really looking to go forward. So of course people like Batshuayi, people like Zaha were left frustrated because they were isolated, and that was just because we couldn't get the ball to them. And you know, maybe he needs a little bit more work in the fact that maybe he might have to come deeper and just adapt his game slightly to get involved in games where we're playing quite deep, or whether it's just the fact that maybe he was just getting out-muscled too easily, and that's why he didn't get service, because the ball was coming into the area and it was just getting cleared by Tottenham. I do think these sort of two things in particular really sort of epitomises why he didn't necessarily have the best of performance. You know, you're looking at the service, that should have been a lot better, because if he'd worked harder, maybe he'd got on the ball more. But then on the other hand, Tottenham defended well, out-muscled him too easily, so that sort of contributed to it overall. And the final thing for me really, and this is just following along from what I said at the Huddersfield game, he needs to learn the offside rule, because once again, in the Huddersfield game, he got caught offside numerous times and we sort of lost count of them. And obviously here against Tottenham again, he could have had a load more chances if he had just learnt to be onside more. So maybe that's something over the week, you know, coming onto this Newcastle game coming up at the weekend, just work on the offside rule. You know, obviously as simple as players might think it is, sometimes you just need to time your run just that little bit slower, or just that little bit faster, or whichever way you need to do it. You need to learn the offside rule, because it was very frustrating that in a game where we had limited chances, we could have had even more if it weren't for players like Batshuayi, of course, being caught offside. But overall, I do think the 5 is a fair result, and I suppose probably in terms of ranking his performances since he's joined Palace, this is probably one of his worst ones. Not just down to him in the fact that he missed a few chances, but mainly down to the rest of the team not necessarily giving him the service. So of course, feel free to comment below with your views of his performance. So I'm now going to move on to the final player in our team, and that is the right winger Wilfried Zaha, who I'm going to give a 6 overall. Now I suppose much the same could be said about his performance in Batshuayi's, in the fact that he was quite isolated for quite a lot of the game, and that was just to the fact that our main focus was to defend. So, you know, in terms of going on the counter-attack, in terms of getting the ball forward, we weren't necessarily that effective at doing that. Now obviously Zaha in particular, I do think he struggled to see quite a lot of the ball in that first half, and like I've said, even though our focus was to obviously sit back and defend in that first half, we had a few chances to counter-attack, but we sort of wasted them, and that's why Zaha struggled to get onto the ball, because if we had a few more counter-attacking opportunities, we could have just sort of played the ball out from the back very quickly, get the ball to Zaha, and let him do his magic and try and dribble into the box. But because we weren't even getting the ball to him in the first place, obviously meant we were quite limited in that respect. Now there was one sort of minor set-to with Sissoko in that second half, and you know, you could look at that and go, you know, maybe you should do better there, but you know, I'm not really going to focus on that. But you know, set-to there with Sissoko in that second half, you know, I'm not really going to talk too much more about that, but I thought I'd just throw it in nonetheless. But I think, you know, once we were 2-0 down, I think that sort of clicked for Hodgson. Obviously, he made 2 substitutions, and that seemed to change our game slightly. Obviously, the game was out of our hands already, but it just gave us a little bit more impetus. We'd just been missing throughout the rest of the game. And, you know, Zaha was one of these players in particular who came into life. We were 2-0 down. He was trying his best to get us back into the game. And there was one chance in particular, you know, we got inside the box. He actually drew a very good save from Lloris, which, you know, just goes to show that actually, if you give the ball to Zaha, he's able to get into the box and he's able to test the goalkeeper. So if we'd done that earlier on in the game, rather than wait until the sort of 80th minute where we're 2-0 down to actually try and attack Tottenham, then maybe we could have had a different story overall. But I've given him a 6, you know, if you're looking at Batshuayi, I gave him a 5. I've just given Zaha a 6 because I just think in that second half he was just ever so better in terms of actually trying to race up against, you know, the Tottenham back four, looking to get in behind. And the fact that he had a shot which of course forced the save out of Lloris as opposed to Batshuayi's, which of course went wide, is one of the reasons why, you know, I've given him a little bit more praise, hence why I've given him a 6 as opposed to the 5 I've given to other players. But overall, feel free to comment below with your thoughts. But I just think it was a slightly quiet performance from Wilf, but I don't think it was all down to him in the fact that, you know, I think the team didn't really help him in the fact that we weren't really supplying him. But overall, I do think the 6 is a fair result. So I'm now going to move briefly on to the 2 substitutions Palace made in the game. Obviously the first of those being Christian Benteke, and of course the second of those being Andros Townsend. Now I'm going to give both of them 5s because I do think the time on the pitch they obviously were slightly better than say the players that they obviously came on to replace. But then on the other hand, because they came on quite late in the game, obviously were quite limited in the fact that the time they had on the pitch to actually make an impact. Now I might as well start with Benteke, obviously giving him a 5 as I've already said, but the thing I liked about his performance is the fact that he came on to be that target man up top, but actually he made a nuisance of himself, you know, running up against the fullbacks or the centre backs, and essentially just making life difficult for Tottenham. And of course that physical presence was something we'd been missing prior to Batshuayi going off, so at least he gave us a little bit of boost coming off the bench. But he should have scored. He had a fantastic chance, obviously great ball in from MacArthur, a free header from a few yards out, centre of goal, and he managed to somehow put it wide. So obviously whilst he made a nuisance of himself and he was doing good things, the negative of that is, and the reason I've given him a 5, is the fact that he had a great chance to score, but of course put it wide. And whether that's just the fact that it was a difficult angle, or just the fact that he's lacking confidence in the fact that he's going a long period of time without scoring, I'm not sure exactly what it is, but of course disappointing nonetheless. But I suppose if you've got to look at his game in comparison to Batshuayi's, I do think that Benteke on the whole actually done a lot more in that 9 minutes he was on the field than Batshuayi done all game. So whether that was just our change of tactics to actually hoof the ball up and get the ball to Benteke, or whether it's just the fact that Batshuayi was having an off day. Obviously Benteke came off the bench and seemed to make a good impact in the fact that he was by far done more than Batshuayi did all game. And of course that begs the question, should he start the next game? I'm not 100% sure, but I do understand why people put that forward. And for me, the only way I see him starting in the next game is if we go to a 4-4-2 and start Batshuayi and Benteke up top, and I don't see Hodgson doing that. So I do think overall I can't really see that going forward. Now of course, as I already mentioned, obviously Andros Townsend was the second sub we made in the game, and of course I've also given him a 5. Now much like quite a lot of our attacking players throughout the rest of the game, didn't really see too much of the ball, but then that's understandable considering he was only on the pitch for such a small amount of time. And actually, when you consider he's an ex-Spurs player, you can understand it maybe being a little bit of an emotional ride, let's say for him, obviously going back to the stadium where of course he started his career, and even though it is a new stadium, he's still going back to his old club, so maybe it was a little bit emotional for him. But obviously he came off the bench, tried to make an impact to the side, and whilst Benteke, it was quite obvious to see what he changed in the game, Andros Townsend was just less so, and maybe that's just because we weren't necessarily looking to get the ball to him. It was more about, we've now got our target man in Benteke who's just come on, let's get the ball to him, as opposed to get the ball to people like Townsend who were playing in the field. But like I've said already, brought in with about 11 minutes to go. In my opinion, brought on too late in the game. Probably should have started the game, but if he had that injury, I can understand him starting on the bench. But you've got to look at it and go, if he had been brought on a bit sooner before we went 2-0 down, bring him on at 1-0, maybe we have a chance because we bring on that attacking impetus. Maybe we could have had a chance, but in the end we didn't. So I do think overall Andros Townsend does obviously deserve the 5 I've given him. And like I've said already, both subs came on, done relatively well, but as the whole team done overall in their performance, it was quite lacklustre. So I do think the 5 overall for both substitutions is a fair result. So now in terms of just a small summary of the game, obviously with it being quite a disappointing performance, don't really want to dwell on it too much, but I've obviously just got a few bullet points here, just really going through the basics of the game, because like I said, don't really want to dwell on it. Now of course going to Spurs, especially with it being the opening of their new stadium, it was always going to be difficult. You've got to put your hands up and go, Spurs are a very good team, and it was always going to be difficult to go there, and we weren't really expecting to get anything from the game. But of course, nonetheless, you would have expected a performance from Palace to be a little bit better, and that was the thing that was disappointing, because whilst Spurs are a good team and it's not really that bad if you lose against them, our performance could have been considerably better, and especially in terms of our advanced play, so in terms of our attacking play, we could have been so much better. Now of course, when you play a top team, it's perfectly fine to obviously sit deep, defend deep for large periods of the game, but eventually Tottenham, as shown by Son's goal and the other goal, eventually they will end up breaking you down and end up scoring. So whilst it's okay to defend deep for the majority of the game, if we don't actually try and attack Tottenham and try and actually penetrate them by actually getting through and scoring your own chances, then of course you're going to find it difficult to get anything from the game. So like I've said, whilst it's very difficult against a top 6 side, you've got to at least try and balance, or have the balance right between actually defending deep and actually being able to go forward, because eventually if you're playing so negative, it's going to come back to hurt you, because eventually they're going to find a way to break you down. Now to be honest, we've done it effectively this season. You've got to look at the Man City game. We defended deep, hit them on the counter-attack, that was successful. But why we failed in this game here against Tottenham, obviously there could be a number of reasons, but ultimately if we want to play this way in terms of sitting deep, absorbing the pressure, we've got to be able to counter on the break, and that's something we didn't do. And if we had done it a little bit more effectively, it would have stopped giving the Spurs defenders a break, so it would have allowed us to capitalise on them actually trying to find their position, and also it would just put pressure on them, because if you hit them on the break and hit them with that sort of element of surprise, then you have that advantage in terms of when you get in that final third, you can obviously get on the end of chances. Now obviously if you're looking back at our defensive work, for the most part it was relatively good, and that's just because in our own half of the pitch we were quite good, but as soon as we got into Spurs' half of the pitch it was like we panicked and we didn't know what to do with the ball, and we basically didn't do anything noteworthy in that half. And you know, aside a few chances that people like Benteke had, people like Jeffrey Slupp had, there weren't that many too many chances in the game, and that's just because as soon as we got in that half we seemed to just give away possession and start that cycle again of just giving the ball away. Now obviously apart from actually just barely getting into Spurs' half, you know, you've got to look at our midfield performance and go, our passing was absolutely awful. We seemed to really be slow on the ball, so we weren't looking to counter really fast and hit Spurs with that element of surprise. And the fact that we just kept looking, we kept giving away possession, kept being weak in tackles, all of these things put together is why our performance was so disappointing, because you can't just rely on players like Tompkins or Gaeta to make saves or tackles. You've got to have the whole team working together, and if you don't do that and you have players giving away the ball, you have players not making tackles, then of course that's going to hurt you going forth in the game, and that certainly was an element of us. Now in terms of our attacking play, obviously it didn't really help that players weren't doing anything noteworthy when they got into Spurs' half of the field, but also there was no movement as well, and there were lots of aimless balls going forward. So of course when you've got aimless balls going forward, it's going to be difficult for people like Batshuayi, people like Zaha to actually get on the end of them, because of course they're too high and they're not the most tallest players. But on the other hand, you've got to make sure you have that movement there. You've got to find yourself into a position where it's easier for your teammates to find you, and of course once again in terms of our attacking play being poor, that was one of the reasons for that. And of course, you know, I've said already, you know, we were probably always going to lose against Spurs, but obviously it was so, well, to me at least, it was so obvious that Spurs would eventually score, and that's just because of our play. Because in terms of our offensive play, we defended fine, but our offensive play, we only really started getting going in the last sort of 5 to 10 minutes or so of the game, which is too late because it was already 2-0, damage was already done. So of course we already knew, put your hands up, we knew that probably Spurs were going to win, the occasion, the quality of the team. But if we had just been a little bit better in that final third, or even if we've just been, in that second half, it's 0-0, we've got nothing to lose either way, we're probably going to lose, but, you know, at least if we attack them, we might have got something from the game. So, of course, once again, that was disappointing. Now, of course, you know, if you look at the game coming up the weekend against Newcastle, we win that on Saturday, then obviously the performance last night against Spurs will be forgotten, put behind us. But then on the other side, you've got to look at it and go, this was a great chance to at least get a point from this game, take us towards it. I think it would be 37 points. That would have been a great thing, but we still find ourselves on 36 points. And I suppose the only real positive is that fact that our goal difference didn't take that much of a battering. I think we were on -2, -3 before, so going back to sort of -4, -5 isn't really that bad considering the other teams below us. But nevertheless, you know, we really should have done better in that game. But I just wish, you know, coming into this game against Newcastle, and I suppose my final point is just that we need a little bit more creativity in the side. Away to Newcastle at the weekend, no easy game, but if we just have a little bit more creativity, we defend well like we did against Tottenham, cut out the individual mistakes and just have that quality in the final third, then touch wood, we might be able to get a result against Newcastle at the weekend. So now I'm going to move on to my Man of the Match award. But before I do that, I give you my Man of the Match and who I thought the biggest influence in the game. I'm now going to give you the 4 nominations I put forward for the award. Now when you consider it was quite a disappointing performance from Palace, of course that sort of reflects sort of the quality that Spurs had, as well as just the way that Palace played overall. You can understand why it's quite difficult to pick a Man of the Match award, mainly because just overall across the field it was obviously a very disappointing sort of lacklustre performance from the team. But I've picked out 4 players here. Obviously you may not necessarily agree with them, but 4 players who I think that made a little bit more difference than say others on the field do, and I think they deserve a little bit more credit, albeit, you know, one of them in particular wasn't fantastic, but in comparison to his teammates, you know, I do think you've got to give these guys a little bit more credit. So in terms of the 4 players I've gone with Vicente Gaeta, Aaron Wan-Bissaka, James Tompkins, and of course the surprising one, Christian Benteke. Now in terms of Vicente Gaeta's performance, obviously like I've said already, and I've talked already in quite a lot of detail, but he made one terrific save in particular, low down to stop Christian Eriksen very early on in the game, so at that point of the game, very crucial in terms of keeping it 0-0, but throughout the rest of the game he was solid, making excellent saves, you know, basically stopping the threat that Spurs were putting at our goal, especially when they got into the area, and of course one save once again at the end of the game, which was fantastic. So for that contribution and goal was obviously why I put him up for the award. Obviously, Aaron Wan-Bissaka at right back, like always, was able to keep the opposition at bay. And obviously, Spurs in particular have got quality down their left-hand side, and he was able to restrict that. But not only that, he was able to play the ball out from the back very well. And, when you consider the Spurs, or the quality that Spurs had in terms of their press, the fact that he was able to overcome that and actually bring the ball out from the out of defence so well was great to see as well. And, he's such a talent. Keep saying it week in, week out. But the fact that he keeps performing like this really just goes to highlight the real quality and the real sort of star we've obviously got on our hands here at Palace. But once again, managed to do really well in terms of restricting Spurs, but I suppose that's something we've come to expect now because he's done so well in recent games. So of course, Vicente Gaeta for his saves, obviously Wan-Bissaka for his defensive contribution. Much the same could be said about James Tompkins. Obviously, in that first half in particular, nothing seemed to get past him. He was winning tackles and making blocks, winning headers all across the shop. And when you consider quite often Spurs play down the middle, quite a lot of their play was coming down the centre of the defence, and the fact that James Tompkins, was winning headers all over the top and basically getting rid of the danger was of course great to see. And of course Benteke is of course the interesting one, but the reason I put him in here is just the fact that when he came off the bench, he actually gave us that attacking impetus which we had been missing earlier on in the game. So whilst he may not have been fantastic because he missed chances, the fact that he just came on made such an impact into the way we played, made a nuisance of himself in terms of his movement, and yes, maybe he should have scored, but that pure fact that he made a difference off the bench, it gave us something we've been missing, is why I've put him forth for the awards. And of course, going over the final two players again, obviously James Tompkins for his defensive work and Benteke for his influence off the bench. Now I think for me there's only one clear winner here, and that's probably public opinion, well I say public opinion, most people's opinion, in the fact that he at 0-0 he kept us in the game and he wasn't really at fault for the 2 goals we conceded. So I'm going to give it to Vicente Gaeta just for the fact that the saves he made, especially early on in the game, to keep us in it. Yes, ultimately we still went on to lose and it didn't matter, but still that contribution, especially at 0-0, obviously deserves to get some credit. So 2 games in a row, Vicente Gaeta's got the man of the match award, obviously highlighting obviously he had a bit of a bad spell, the Watford game and so on, so it's nice to see him get back to his old self. So congratulations, don't get a trophy or certificate, but you do get my sincere congratulations on what was yet another solid performance from you. And if you're looking at the 4 players I've got here, it was between Gaeta and Wan-Bissaka to win it, but just for the pure fact of just the importance of Gaeta's involvement as opposed to Wan-Bissaka. Yes, he was good defensively, but the sheer importance of the involvement, obviously Gaeta tips that. And if you do disagree with this, of course feel free to comment it below, and of course if you think I've missed someone out, of course feel free to comment that below as well. So now you've heard my match report, player rankings and my man of the match. That concludes this week's podcast. Now I've got interviews with Roy Hodgson, James Tompkins, James McArthur and Cheku Kiate following the game.
James, that must feel like scant reward for putting up an obdurate defence for so long.
Yeah, we knew it was going to be hard, under the circumstances. It's always tough, I suppose. Coming to the new stadium is always going to be a bit tougher, I suppose. But we gave it a good go. First half we kept them pretty quiet. Had a few chances, but in the main I think we've done pretty well. I think we all know we can do better, but it was their day today.
As well as a good team, were you also facing a tidal wave of emotion tonight?
Yeah, I think at the start it's not ideal. With the ceremony, it goes on for quite long. You're standing there for quite a while. It's just a bit surreal, something you're not really used to. But it's always going to be, the atmosphere is always going to be great, and we kept them quiet, and that was the main thing. I think coming here and keeping that crowd quiet for as long as we could, and we did that, but we just couldn't quite get the win.
Having said that, did you feel, as you got them to half-time, not just kept them quiet, but starting to get a little bit edgy?
Yeah, I think that's the main thing, making it edgy, coming here, with their first game. Obviously everyone's full of emotion, not just the players, so we did in the main, and we'll take some positives out of that going into important games Saturday.
The biggest positives that the 2 teams below you that played tonight both lost.
Yeah, sometimes it's not nice looking at other results and hoping for losses here and there, but that's the reality of it. But hopefully we can get some points on the board from now until the end of the season.
James, can you just get your reaction to the result?
Disappointed. Didn't really cause them too many problems until the end when we had a couple of chances. Kept it quite tight. Defence played well. But disappointed we couldn't get anything from the game.
Yeah, must have been great going in at half time at 0-0, and you actually managed to quiet their fans down, so they're pretty loud at the start.
Yeah, that was obviously the aim, to try and stay in the game as long as possible, and obviously try and counter them towards the end, but they got that goal they were looking for, and it was hard from there.
What did you make of the stadium?
It's obviously a nice stadium. You can see for yourself they've done a great job, and they'll be hoping to turn that into a fortress here.
Eku, 2-0 defeat, but it looked like it was going to be a draw for so long, didn't it?
Yes, it's disappointing for you because it's possible to take some point today, but we lost this game. We have a good organization for the first half and in the beginning for the second half, but after the Tottenham goal, the game came in very, very difficult for you. Now, we lost this game. It's very, very difficult for the team, and now we just need to forget this game and focus for Saturday game.
And what do Spurs do to make it difficult to break them down?
No, it's we have a good organization. Maybe we take this first goal. It's one goal coming. Nobody know, because we lost this ball and we lost the organization and the goal come here. But it's normal. This is football. Sometimes if you take some risk, they happen it. Just forget this game and continue to work hard and prepare the last game.
And what did you think of the occasion, playing in the first game at the new stadium?
Yeah, it's very good. It's very very nice. We know this game is very special for Tottenham players because they want to win this game. We come here also to win some point, but we lost. Yes, we need to forget this game.
Roy, we put up solid resistance for long periods during the game. What did you make of it all?
I thought we needed to sort of just hang on another 5 or 10 minutes. I think the goal came when we were, just starting to find our feet a little bit. I think if we could have just held on another 5 or 10 minutes, it was a bit unfortunate, the goal with the deflection, of course. Had we not conceded that one then, I think, maybe the last 20 minutes or so could have been quite interesting. But of course, once they got the goal and they've been the dominant team, there's no question of that. It was always going to be tough for us then. But I thought the lads, made a fist of it, certainly in the second half, and had 1 or 2 little chances at the end. But we can't complain about the result. They played very, very well. Tottenham, it was a very, very good performance from their side, and I can't be that disappointed with my side in terms of the resistance we put up, as you say, and the sort of effort we made at the end to try and get ourselves back in it.
In fact, you nearly had a decent half chance with Jeff Schlupp very, very early in the game where he could have stolen the glory.
Yeah, that's right. No, it was their evening. We can't say much about that, but I think we did the best that we could possibly do. It certainly, there was no surrender on our side. There were some good performances at the back. Tompkins, I thought in particular, was absolutely outstanding. The goalkeeper made a couple of very good saves. But we came across a good team, and it was obviously a very important night for them. And after that opening goal, it was always going to be very hard for us to get something from it.
I suppose not so much a grieving, but just the way it goes. There were 2, unfortunately, scruffy goals in many ways.
Yeah, the first one in particular, I thought, and then the second one was a bit of a stumble. But they came, unfortunately, especially the second one came from us giving the ball away very badly. And there were a few instances in the game where we gave the ball away badly, and we don't do that often. But we were punished, unfortunately, for it, and that's credit, of course, to Tottenham for their pressurising and their forcing errors, if you like, forcing mistakes. But that's what cost us in the end, and for both the goals, really, came from us giving the ball away at a time when we needn't have done so.
Of course, nobody likes to revel in others' misfortunes, but the good news tonight is the 2 teams below you that played both lost.
Yeah, I suppose so, but I'll think about that when I've got over this defeat. We've now got a very short turnaround. We've got another very big game coming up at Newcastle on Saturday, so I'll use tomorrow to try and get this game out of our system, and I don't take any joy at the moment from the fact that the teams below us lost as well. We'd have liked to have come here and taken something from the game, and I thought for 50, 60 minutes it looked like we might be able to do that. But as I say, the first goal put us very much on the back foot, and I thought even at the end at 2-0 we were still going for it, we were still trying to get ourselves back in the game, so all credit to the players in that respect.
So there you have it. Now you've heard what Roy Hodgson, James Tompkins, James McArthur and Cheku Kouyaté had to say after the game. That concludes this week's podcast for the game against Tottenham. But make sure to come out next week from a post-match review of the game against Newcastle. So thanks for listening and remember to up the Palace!